I arrived at the hospital just after midnight, still wearing my district maintenance jacket, the reflective strip dulled from years of washing, the cuffs stained with grease that never quite came out. The parking structure echoed as I walked in, my boots loud in a place built for quiet urgency. Inside, the hospital had been transformed for donors and board members. Soft lighting, polished floors, catered silence. This was the night tied to my wife's promotion. A night I was told to stop by briefly to be present, though no one explained where I fit. They kept me to the side, near a private corridor marked for VIP access. Executives and surgeons moved past without seeing me. Then her boss, her surgeon mentor, spoke loudly enough for the corridor to hear, praising her rise, her discipline, her independence. He made a point of saying she had done it all on her own. I stood there while polite smiles passed between board members. My wife didn't correct him. She stayed composed, professional, distant. In that moment, I understood my role had already been decided for me. I stayed long enough to see the pattern clearly, then left. In the garage, I made a decision that would not involve confrontation or emotion. It would involve documents, timing, and law. Before the story continues, I need to ask something of you. If you've ever stood quietly while your life was rewritten in front of others, I'd like you to subscribe and stay with me. And if you've lived through something similar, tell me in the comments. Knowing I wasn't alone mattered more than I expected. Before that night at the hospital, our life had been quiet in the way only long marriages become. Not empty, just settled. The kind of calm earned by years of routine, shared responsibility, and the absence of drama. We lived in a modest suburban house not far from where I worked maintenance for the district. Nothing flashy. A place chosen for practicality more than pride. The kids were grown and gone, their rooms repurposed into storage and silence. I had worked facilities maintenance for most of my adult life. Steady work. Predictable hours when nothing broke, long nights when it did. I knew buildings the way some men know land, by feel, by sound, by what shouldn't be vibrating but was. Pipes, electrical panels, boilers, roofs. I fixed what failed and kept records clean. No one noticed me unless something went wrong, which suited me fine. My wife had gone the opposite direction. Clean offices, clean shoes, administrative tracks that rewarded patience and proximity. She started in scheduling, moved into compliance, then operations. Hospitals reward people who understand process and hierarchy. She understood both. I was proud of her in a quiet way, the way you are when someone you love builds something carefully over time. Our household ran on mutual independence. We didn't check each other's phones. We didn't question late meetings. Trust had become the default setting. Dinners were simple. Weekends slower. We spoke less, but when we did, it was efficient, familiar. The kind of marriage people assume is boring until they realize how hard it is to sustain. Then came the pregnancy. Late in life. Unexpected. Not planned. We stared at the test together in the bathroom, both of us silent longer than we should have been. Fear and responsibility arrived before joy. At our age, you don't imagine starting over. You measure risk. You calculate energy. But we agreed to try. Quietly. Carefully. The birth came early. Too early. The NICU became our second address for weeks. Machines breathing for something small and fragile that had arrived before it was ready. I picked up extra shifts without complaint. Overtime came easily when I didn't ask for days off. Someone always needed a boiler checked at 2 a.m. My wife leaned into the hospital. Into leadership. Into the structure she trusted. Her surgeon boss became a constant presence. Always available, always supportive. Late night updates. Private meetings. I didn't question it. In crisis, you accept help where it comes from. At home, small things began to change. She came back later. Her phone stayed face down. New clothes appeared, sharper than necessary. She corrected me in front of others with a tone that felt rehearsed. Phrases entered her vocabulary that didn't sound like hers. They sounded like policy. Like authority. I noticed, but I didn't confront. Confrontation closes doors too early. I watched instead. Listened. Took mental notes. Maintenance teaches you that failure rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up as patterns first, small deviations that only matter if you're paying attention. By the time that donor night arrived, the distance between us had already been measured. I just hadn't acknowledged it yet. That night didn't create the fracture. It revealed it. When I left the hospital garage and drove home, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. The kind that comes when something you've been trying not to name finally stands still long enough to be seen. And once I saw it, I knew exactly how to proceed. I didn't sleep much after that night. Not because my mind was racing, but because it was quiet in a way that made thinking unavoidable. When you've worked maintenance long enough, you learn the difference between noise and warning. Noise can be ignored. Warnings cannot. I didn't mention the donor event to my wife when I got home. I didn't ask how it went. I didn't tell her I'd been there. She came in late, moved carefully through the house, and went to sleep without waking me. That, too, was information. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention without changing my behavior. I went to work on time. I fixed what broke. I kept my routines intact. People assume silence means ignorance. It usually doesn't. Silence is often preparation. The NICU period ended. The baby came home. Fragile but alive. I took night feedings when I could. I handled the practical things, sterilizers, logs, schedules. My wife spent more time at the hospital than was strictly necessary. Meetings bled into evenings. Support sessions extended past midnight. Her explanations were efficient, professional, incomplete. I noticed how often the surgeon's name came up. Always in context. Always justified. I noticed how our conversations shifted from shared concern to managed updates, as if I were being briefed rather than included. I noticed how she corrected me when I asked questions not sharply but decisively, like a superior managing scope. At home she began mirroring him in small ways. Language first. Then posture. Then impatience with anything that didn't move quickly. She had always been ambitious, but this was different. This was alignment. I still didn't confront her. Confrontation gives people time to prepare defenses. I didn't want defenses. I wanted truth, and truth doesn't come from arguments. It comes from records. I contacted a retired investigator a colleague had used years earlier for a property dispute. Quiet man. Methodical. No digital trail unless necessary. We met once, off-site, and I was clear about what I wanted. Confirmation of patterns, not assumptions. Dates. Times. Movements. Nothing that could be dismissed as speculation. I didn't tell him what I suspected. I told him what I needed to know. Weeks passed. I worked. I listened. I watched the house feel less like a shared space and more like a waiting room. The baby slept between us like a fragile ceasefire. Then the first report came back. Same hotel. Same weekdays. Entry and exit within minutes of each other. Repeated. Predictable. No effort to hide it because no one was supposed to be looking. I didn't react. I asked for verification. The investigator kept going. Expanded scope. And that's when something else surfaced. Something neither of them had been careful enough to separate. Financial irregularities tied to her department. Vendors that didn't exist. Purchase orders that didn't match deliveries. Payments routed through layers thin enough to be missed by anyone not looking closely. And when you followed the trail far enough, it looped back toward accounts connected to the surgeon. That was when I understood this wasn't just personal. It was structural. I verified the last detail myself. Quietly. Through formal channels. A paternity test, ordered and documented properly, tied to the timeline of the early birth. I didn't open the result immediately. I stored it with the others. Emotion makes people sloppy. Documents don't. By the time the evidence was complete, my marriage had already ended in everything but paperwork. What remained was process. And I was very good with process. Once you understand that something is broken beyond repair, the urgency disappears. Panic is for people who still believe outcomes can be negotiated through emotion. I had already moved past that stage. What remained was sequencing. I duplicated everything. Physical copies, encrypted drives, off-site storage. One set stayed with my attorney. Another with the accountant. A third existed only so nothing could ever be fully erased. I didn't trust systems owned by people who believe themselves untouchable. The forensic accountant worked slowly and carefully, which I appreciated. Fraud doesn't unravel all at once. It loosens thread by thread. Vendor shells. Inflated service lines. Payments justified as emergency capacity needs during the NICU expansion. All of it plausible in isolation. Indefensible in aggregate. While that work progressed, I began moving assets quietly. Nothing dramatic. No sudden changes that would raise questions. Trust structures established for reasons that made sense on paper. Long-term planning. Child protection. Standard precaution for someone my age with late life dependence. The language mattered. The timing mattered more. At home, the temperature dropped further. My wife spoke to me less. When she did, it was transactional. Updates, reminders, corrections. She had already placed me somewhere behind her, and that distance made what I was doing easier. Emotional separation reduces risk. The investigator's updates continued. Same patterns. Same confidence. No deviation. People involved in long-running affairs start to believe repetition is invisibility. It never is. I brought my older children in quietly. Not all at once. One meeting. Kitchen table. No raised voices. Just facts laid out in order. Dates. Documents. Timelines. I didn't ask for opinions. I asked for discretion. They understood. Support doesn't always look like agreement. Sometimes it looks like silence when silence is necessary. I continued going to work every day. Fixed a failed pump at a middle school. Replaced lighting in a civic building. Signed off on inspection reports. Routine is camouflage. No one questions a man who stays consistent. My wife grew colder. More distant. I think she assumed I felt it and didn't care. She was half right. When the accountant finished quantifying totals and routing paths, the number was larger than I expected. Enough to justify escalation. Enough to trigger oversight beyond internal discipline. My attorney filed when everything was ready. Divorce papers served during business hours. Formal packets delivered to the hospital board the same week. Not anonymously. Properly. With names, documentation, and legal framing that made ignoring it impossible. I didn't watch the fallout directly. I didn't need to. Institutions react predictably when liability becomes visible. Emergency meetings. Closed doors. Phone calls that don't return. I waited. The hospital announced another donor night a month later. Same window. Same corridor. I arrived again after midnight, dressed the same way, and stood where I could be seen this time. Everything I needed was already prepared. And this time I wasn't there to observe. The second donor night felt different the moment I walked in. Same building, same lighting, same catered quiet, but the rhythm was off. Institutions develop instincts the way people do. Something had already begun to move beneath the surface, and everyone could feel it even if they didn't know why. I didn't go to the side corridor this time. I stood where donors gathered before being ushered through security doors, near the edge of the main lobby where visibility mattered. I wasn't dressed for the occasion. The maintenance jacket stayed on. The contrast worked in my favor. People notice what doesn't belong. Screens had been set up along the wall for promotional loops, expansion plans, gratitude messages, future initiatives. I waited until the flow slowed, until enough people were present to make attention unavoidable. Timing is everything. Not dramatic timing. Administrative timing. I connected what I needed to connect. Nothing flashy. Just documents rendered clearly, legibly, in sequence. Dates. Photographs. Transaction paths. Vendor names that didn't exist until money passed through them. Side-by-side timelines that showed personal meetings aligning perfectly with departmental approvals. No commentary. The material spoke for itself. People stopped walking. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Staff recognized patterns before donors did. Board members recognized liability immediately. You can see it in posture, the moment confidence shifts into calculation. My wife arrived late as expected. She saw the screens before she saw me. I didn't watch her reaction closely. I didn't need to. Shock looks the same on everyone when they realize control has already left the room. I added the final document last. The one I had kept sealed until that moment. Formal. Verified. Tied cleanly to dates no one could argue with. Not accusation, confirmation. That was when the atmosphere changed completely. Phones came out. Someone stepped away too quickly. Another person began asking questions no one wanted to answer in public. Then I disclosed the last pressure point, not emotionally, not loudly, but clearly enough for leadership to understand the implication. The land beneath the hospital. The LLC. The long-term agreements they assumed were background noise. Control doesn't need to be exercised to be effective. It only needs to be acknowledged. The room moved into containment mode. That's the best way to describe it. No shouting. No scene. Just rapid redirection, private instructions, security appearing without explanation. I stepped back when it was over. There was nothing left to add. Everything that mattered was already in motion. The rest unfolded through official channels. Emergency board sessions. Authorities involved. Arrests processed quietly the way institutions prefer. Divorce finalized without argument. Custody and guardianship terms set to protect the child, not punish anyone else. I returned to work the following week. Fixed a valve that had been sticking for months. Signed off on a safety report. Ate lunch alone in my truck like always. The hospital still stands. The system adjusted. I went home to a quieter house and began rebuilding a life that no longer required me to stand off to the side. Rebuilding didn't begin the way people imagine. There was no relief, no sense of victory, no sudden lightness. What came first was quiet, thick, structural quiet. The kind you hear after a system shuts down and you're waiting to see if anything else is going to fail. The house felt larger once it was just me and the baby. Not emptier, larger. Rooms reclaimed their purpose slowly. I moved things only when they were in the way. I didn't rush to erase anything. Erasure is another form of panic. Custody arrangements settled quickly once facts replaced arguments. Guardianship terms were precise. Neutral. Built around stability, not blame. I followed them exactly. Consistency matters when a child arrives into a world already altered by adults. Work became my anchor again. I took the same routes. Drank coffee from the same thermos. Signed into the same maintenance logs. People at work didn't ask questions. They never do. Maintenance men exist outside narrative unless something breaks badly enough to demand a name. At night, after feedings, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed documents one last time, not because they were still needed, but because closing a process properly matters. You don't leave systems half dismantled. You shut them down cleanly so nothing reactivates later. The hospital's name came up in the news once, briefly. Carefully worded statements. Administrative restructuring. No mention of me. That was fine. Visibility was never the point. Resolution was. Friends checked in quietly. My children visited when they could. No one pushed for explanations. Everyone understood that some things, once spoken aloud, lose their usefulness. I adjusted to the new rhythm the way I always had, incrementally. Bottles cleaned. Floors swept. Schedules aligned. Trust rebuilt not in people but in routine. What surprised me most wasn't the absence of my wife. It was the absence of noise I hadn't realized she brought with her. The house breathed differently. Even the walls seemed less tense. One evening, weeks later, I stood in the doorway of the baby's room and watched him sleep. No machines. No alarms. Just breath, steady and real. I understood then that everything I'd done, the restraint, the patience, the refusal to confront early, had been about this exact stillness. Not revenge. Not recognition. Stability. That was the only outcome I'd ever been interested in. People assume collapse is loud. That it comes with shouting, slammed doors, explanations demanded and given too late. They imagine destruction as spectacle because spectacle is easier to process than quiet displacement. What they don't understand is that some endings are administrative. Filed. Time. Enforced. And when those end, the silence afterward isn't empty, it's cleared ground. What people thought I lost was a marriage, status by association, proximity to power. They assumed I'd been removed from something important. What I actually lost was friction. Constant correction. The need to justify my presence in rooms I had helped sustain without ever being acknowledged. I stopped being introduced as an accessory. I stopped being background. Not because anyone elevated me, but because no one could minimize me anymore. There's a difference. The hospital faded from my daily awareness. I passed it sometimes on service routes, just another building with systems that required attention. Buildings don't care who failed inside them. They only respond to maintenance done correctly or ignored too long. Raising an infant later in life is humbling. Your body doesn't recover as quickly. Your patience is tested in quieter ways. But the clarity helps. There's no room for performative parenting when you're tired enough to focus only on what works. You don't chase ideals. You establish function. I learned which cries meant hunger, which meant discomfort, which meant nothing at all. I learned that consistency builds trust faster than affection alone. That applied to the child and to me. Occasionally someone would ask, carefully, if I was all right. I always said yes. Not because I was avoiding truth but because I understood it differently now. Being all right doesn't mean untouched. It means operational. I no longer waited for validation. Not from institutions. Not from people who confused proximity to authority with worth. I had documents that told the truth when words had failed, and a life that no longer required me to stand aside while others spoke over it. Loss had refined my priorities instead of scattering them. I slept better. I spoke less. I listened more, to systems, to patterns, to what didn't add up. That's what people miss when they watch something fall quietly. They don't see the recalibration. They don't see the gains because gains don't announce themselves. Time has a way of exposing assumptions without ever speaking. People who mistook my silence for weakness eventually learned the difference, not through confrontation but through absence. I wasn't where they expected me to be anymore, and that unsettled them more than anger ever could have. The hospital moved on the way institutions always do, quietly replacing names, rewriting procedures, issuing internal memos no one outside would ever read. To them it was containment and continuity. To the people involved it was erasure. Titles vanished. Access disappeared. Networks went silent. Power, once removed from a system, doesn't linger. It evaporates. I heard fragments through others, never directly. Investigations concluded. Charges formalized. Careers ended without ceremony. The surgeon's name stopped circulating in professional spaces. My wife relocated her ambition somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter, where history didn't follow as closely. None of it interested me. Consequences are only satisfying if you're still emotionally invested. I wasn't. My focus stayed narrow. Home. The child. Repetition built stability. Stability built confidence. Not the loud kind, but the kind that lets you walk into any room without needing to be acknowledged. People eventually stopped asking questions. Not because they had answers, but because they realized there was nothing to extract from me. Silence, when sustained long enough, becomes a boundary. I watched my child grow stronger. I marked milestones without announcement. First steady sleep through the night. First unassisted steps. Each one arrived without witnesses beyond me, and that made them feel intact, untouched by outside expectation. Every so often I thought back to that first donor night, to the corridor where I'd been placed off to the side. I understood now that it wasn't humiliation. It was clarity delivered early. It showed me exactly how I was being categorized so I could decide whether to accept it. I didn't. Time corrected the misjudgment without my help. It always does as long as you don't interfere with it by trying to be seen. Dignity isn't something you assert. It isn't declared, defended, or demanded. It's something you pay for over time, usually in ways that don't look impressive while you're paying them. Most people confuse dignity with pride. Pride wants witnesses. Dignity prefers accuracy. I paid for mine slowly. By not reacting when reaction would have felt justified. By letting misinterpretations stand long enough for facts to overtake them. By choosing procedure over impulse, even when impulse would have been easier and louder. There were moments, quiet ones, when the cost became visible. Forms that asked for marital status. Emergency contact updates that required names to be removed. Small administrative erasures that reminded me a life had been dismantled carefully, piece by piece. None of it hurt sharply. It pressed instead like weight distributed evenly. People assume dignity protects you from loneliness. It doesn't. What it does is prevent loneliness from turning into desperation. There's a difference. One weakens judgment. The other sharpens it. I didn't speak poorly of my wife. Not to the children. Not to colleagues. Not even privately once the process was complete. Contempt is expensive. It corrodes more than it satisfies. I had already spent enough energy maintaining systems that didn't return the effort. Raising the child alone refined that discipline. Children don't need explanations shaped by resentment. They need environments that feel predictable and safe. I made sure the house felt that way. Same routines. Same tone. Same patience even when I was tired enough to forget my own name. Occasionally, I caught my reflection in windows, older than I remembered, steadier than I expected. I recognized the man looking back. That mattered. Identity isn't preserved by fighting to be seen. It's preserved by acting in ways you'd still respect if no one ever noticed. Dignity cost me a marriage, proximity to influence, and the illusion of shared ambition. What it gave me instead was something quieter and more durable: self-consistency. I knew why every decision had been made. There were no revisions needed later. That's the part people miss. Dignity doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It feels like restraint. Strength shows up later when nothing needs to be defended anymore. Forgiveness didn't make me warmer. It made me lighter. Less reactive. More present. It created room for attention to flow forward instead of looping backward. That mattered most with the child. Children sense unresolved tension even when it's never spoken. As I released mine, his environment steadied further. Calm compounds. Forgiveness wasn't something I granted. It was something I stopped withholding from myself. Justice didn't arrive as a moment. There was no single day where everything felt resolved. It came in increments, like paperwork moving through offices that didn't care about emotion, only completion. That was fitting. Emotion had already had its turn. This part belonged to process. The investigations concluded without spectacle. Findings were issued. Actions taken. Names removed from directories and letterhead. Access revoked. Charges handled where they belonged, behind doors that close automatically and don't reopen without authorization. Justice, in its functional form, doesn't announce itself. It just changes what people are allowed to do next. The divorce finalized cleanly. No last-minute demands. No revisionist arguments. Everything had already been documented too thoroughly for narrative to matter. Custody arrangements remained intact. The child stayed where stability had been established. That was the only outcome I cared about. Financially, nothing dramatic happened. Assets remained where they should have been. Trusts functioned exactly as designed. The systems I'd put in place held. That was justice too, preventing damage instead of repairing it later. I never spoke publicly about any of it. I didn't need vindication. People who mattered understood without being told. People who didn't matter moved on quickly. Silence carried the truth efficiently. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. Not disappointment, just clarity. Justice, when done correctly, doesn't produce emotion. It produces equilibrium. Things stop leaning in the wrong direction. I stood in my kitchen one evening after everything was finalized, holding the child while the kettle boiled. The house felt balanced. No tension pulling at the edges. No unresolved threads. That was justice. Not punishment. Not exposure. Balance restored. Peace didn't feel the way I had imagined it might when I was younger. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It didn't arrive with any sense of arrival at all. It showed up quietly, like a system that finally stops vibrating once the load is balanced correctly. Peace was waking up without rehearsing conversations that would never happen. It was walking through the house without anticipating correction or tension. It was knowing exactly where I stood in my own life without needing anyone else to confirm it. I stopped thinking of the past as something that needed interpretation. It became context instead, useful only insofar as it explained why certain safeguards existed now. I didn't relive it. I referenced it the way you reference a previous failure in a building. Noted, corrected, not repeated. The child grew into the space naturally. There was no drama attached to his days. No competing narratives. Just routine, presence, and time. That's what peace looks like to someone too tired for illusion. It's unremarkable in the best possible way. I stayed in the same job. Same routes. Same responsibilities. People came and went around me chasing promotions, recognition, leverage. I fixed what broke and went home. My life no longer required expansion to feel complete. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sat on the back steps after the house went quiet and listened to nothing in particular. No sirens. No phones. No unresolved tension humming under the surface. Just the sound of things holding together. That's when I understood what peace actually was. Not the absence of struggle. Not the presence of joy. Peace was alignment between what I valued, what I did, and what I refused to tolerate anymore. I hadn't won anything. I had simply stopped losing pieces of myself to rooms that never intended to make space for me.